Very excited to have Dr. Meryl Nass on today. You all are going to learn a lot, and she's going to be here in 1 second. First, I just want to give a shout out to my sponsors. If you are interested in having something great to drink as the holidays approach, don't forget that another way to support my work, other than joining my locals community, which is AllisonMorrow.locals.com, you can be on my editorial board, is check out my sponsors. If you go to AllisonWinePromo.com, you get 50% off some amazing Malbecs from Argentina. They're all extreme altitude Malbecs, some from almost 9,000 feet. These are rarely imported to the United States, and you can't get them at the grocery store. Why would you want to? They're not censored wines. They're just high altitude. They're extremist in the way that the Department of Homeland Security, I guess, doesn't care about. So go get some extremist altitude wine and support my work. Also, if you are a coffee drinker, you know that you can also get some coffee and support my work at twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. You get 10% off your first order. These are USDA certified organic roasts. There are light roast, there's dark roast, there's medium roast. They're limited edition, black edition here, which is really good. It's a very smooth coffee if you like that. But there's also tea. If you're a tea drinker, you can get some Katura tea. It's tea you make from the coffee fruit. It's very good. It's like a black tea. So check out my sponsors. And thanks again for the support. Again, remember, if you go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com, you can also join my editorial board, like I was saying. And it's $5 a month if you want to get exclusive content, comment, post, join my editorial board, and post questions for interviews ahead of time. But it's free if all you want to do is just get some of the content that's on there. So thanks again, everybody, for watching. Let's bring in Dr. Nass. Okay, so welcome back. This is Dr. Nass's second time. She came on earlier in the year after her license was suspended. She is a doctor in Maine. She was one of the most egregious cases I'd ever heard of really medical censorship. Dr. Nass, if I get this correct, you were basically targeted over a lot of what you had said about the pandemic, and also for treatments that you were legally allowed to prescribe to your patients. And not only was your license suspended, but you actually have to undergo a psychiatric evaluation to make sure that you live in reality, which is so funny given likely some of the stuff that the people who are suspending you think, and maybe we would wonder if they live in reality. But anyway, we can talk about that another time, right? So let's before we get into where your case stands and everything, I want to talk to you about bioterrorism, because that is one of your specialties, and I think maybe a lot of people who have only been introduced to you through mainstream articles about your suspension don't know the high level research you've done on certain things like anthrax, for instance. And so could we maybe start there? We're the title of the video is basically discussing, and they're not as many answers maybe as there are questions, but discussing Ebola, anthrax, and COVID, and just hearing your expertise on it. Let's start with anthrax. Take us back in time when you started looking into it. What was the question that you were seeking to answer?
In 1988, 24 years ago, students at UMass were investigating Pentagon contracts with the university, and they came across a professor who used to work at Fort Detrick, who was doing anthrax research for the Defense Department. And they asked my group of physicians for social responsibility to please help them understand what this professor was doing. Was it germ warfare? And so I agreed to review the contract, and it turned out, although the contract said it was for vaccine research, it was actually a primitive form of genetic engineering of anthrax. And as a result, I thought, gee, why is the Pentagon interested in anthrax? We don't even have it in the United States. We had one case a decade then. And so I decided to start looking into recent anthrax outbreaks, and at the same time look into the Biological Weapons Convention, which was a international treaty the United States had initiated that had gone into force in 1975, 13 years earlier, that banned the use of biological warfare. You could not research or develop biological weapons. And most of the countries in the world were signatories to this treaty. So, why were we interested in anthrax? There were just very few cases in the world. And so through my research at that time, which was very extensive, and lasted for 3 years. I found that the world's largest anthrax epidemic, which is called an epizootic because people get it from animals and animal products, was due to biological warfare. It infected over 10,000 people, and there were about 200 deaths that were recorded in Africans in Rhodesia during its civil war. So from 1978 to 1981, this anthrax outbreaks started occurring throughout Rhodesia. Now it's called Zimbabwe. It was an apartheid nation run by the Ian Smith white Rhodesian government, although 95% of the population were Black, and they were limited in where they could live and where they could farm. So there were areas that were only open for Black habitation, and it was only those areas that were affected by anthrax. So it was a very interesting story. There were many things going on during that war involving chemical agents and other biological agents, as it turned out. So it was a dirty war. A lot of false flags, a lot poisonings, etc. And anthrax was part of it. And I wrote a paper which got published in 1992. Next month, it'll be 30 years. And I showed that all the explanations that had been put forward to try to explain how this outbreak could possibly occur didn't make sense. And that there was really no other possibility but that it was biological warfare.
What were, this was, I don't know how old I was. You said 88?
Yes. And the paper was published in 92. Yes.
Okay.
88.
Okay. So 7 and 10, or no, 11 years old. So I wasn't paying attention to this. I barely was paying attention to this like 3 years ago. So you're going to have to tell me at the time, what were they saying was happening? So you say you find out it was biological warfare, but you were looking into it, I'm guessing, because there was some other storyline that was being pushed. Am I right? What was that?
Yeah. So I actually reviewed every anthrax outbreak that had occurred in the prior 15 years. And all of them looked, pretty similar. Some were oral due to eating contaminated meat. Some were cutaneous, in other words, skin anthrax due to skin contact. And of course, there were no aerosolized anthrax outbreaks. At this point in time, they used to occur in factories, enclosed spaces where the anthrax spores from animal products like goat hair or sheepskins would get into the air and people would inhale them. But these days, we know how to process those animal skins and other animal products so that people are no longer exposed indoors to viable anthrax spores. Anyway, so I looked at all the epidemics, and this one was totally different. It happens to have been the largest ever recorded in the world. It happened during a civil war. It respected the borders of Rhodesia. It only occurred in Black areas. It did not fit with the climate. So anthrax occurs usually when there are certain climate changes. I hate to use that term, but usually after a drought or a flood in which the anthrax spores in the soil are able to germinate, at least that's my theory, and they outcompete other soil organisms. And so animals that are grazing or browsing in that soil ingest a lot of anthrax spores. And that's how anthrax outbreaks in animals occur. So the kinds of weather conditions and the special properties of soil that are required for that to happen were not present in the places in Rhodesia, in all the places in Rhodesia where the outbreaks occurred. So there was really no other explanation. And then, so I laid all that out. And then I said, well, how did people explain the epidemic? So there were a lot of explanations that had been conjured up. One was that Black people were so poor at that time in the middle of the war that they were carrying meat on buses or, train. I don't know if there were any trains, but from one part of the country to the other and starting outbreaks there. And I explained why that couldn't happen. One was that the veterinary services were no longer operating, and so when an animal who died of anthrax was found, the carcass could not be appropriately treated and buried, and that was causing it. And there was an explanation that flies were doing it. Flies were eating from one animal and going to the next animal. So I broke down all of the explanations. There were 5 or 6 of them, and
Real fast.
none of them made sense.
Real fast, Dr. Nass. So curious, when you then heard like the whole somebody ate a bat and COVID became a reality. That's just what I started thinking. Were you just like, come on. I mean, what were your thoughts when you heard that?
Well, so I am aware, having followed these potential pandemic pathogens and their regulation for over 30 years, I know that the federal government publishes accidents that occur in labs working with SARS, Ebola, anthrax, etc., and that the United States knows about 100 accidents a year at these labs using these what are designated as select agent organisms. And so everybody, in the field knows about this. So everybody's just been waiting for an accident to occur. In fact, there are already accidents. There were people working at Fort Detrick who caught some of the agents they were working with and not realizing it, went into the local hospital where potentially they could have spread it to other people. That didn't happen. There was a fellow working in Chicago.
Did they call them accidents? What do they call them?
What do they call them? That's a good.
I bet they have another word for it.
I don't remember. I haven't looked at the brochure since I blogged about it a couple of years ago. But it's a yearly report that comes out. CDC and USDA jointly run the program. You can't have an accident without reporting it to them, and you can't transfer any of these organisms or sell them without getting their permission. So anyway, I figured everybody'd been waiting for a lab accident. The first thing I thought of was a lab accident. Bat soup, that didn't make a whole lot of sense, but things happen. We think, as far as anybody knows, as far as I know, the first SARS outbreak in China in 2002 did come from an animal to a human. And so it wasn't completely, out of the realm of possibility, but it was just that the likelihood was probably greater that it was a lab accident than something else.
Okay, sorry, muted myself because the baby did in fact wake up. So everyone, the associate producer is in the studio. Hopefully he will not take over the stream. I'm rocking him with my foot. So somebody said maybe are they called breaches? Is it a breach? Maybe that's what they call it. I don't know.
I don't think that's the term, but
they probably want to call it.
Most of the accidents are confined within the lab. And CDC does not tell you a lot about any of the accidents, so they don't describe them. They list them. They don't. In most cases, they don't tell you what happened. They will say at the end of the year, we made sure that nobody was in danger, or the people who were involved. If somebody got a needle stick, we put them into a quarantine site, and because that has happened. Americans and Russians have died from the organisms they study, and sometimes they have to be quarantined within Fort Detrick for that purpose. So they tell you a little bit and you don't really know what happened, but you're supposed to feel reassured that we couldn't have a deadly pandemic because of this, even though everybody knows we can.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realize how common it is that you're talking about that. Okay, so when you're discussing, or like before we move on to Ebola, what are the big takeaways from what you learned studying anthrax that you think for the general public watching right now would be, a good sort of, I don't know, understanding of maybe either similarities or just questions that you feel like are still unanswered when it comes to these, but seem to feel like, we've got maybe it's a pattern. It would be too much, but something that just feels like, we're not learning from our mistakes, I guess, or
No,
maybe it's not even a mistake.
well, not only are we not learning from our mistakes, but the public is never being told the truth about what
Yeah.
actually happened. And so they have no way of learning because they don't know. Um, Anthrax, so all these different biological weapons that the United States has researched, and we stockpile them. And we don't know who has stockpiles of any of these weapons now because the United States has interfered with the potential of the Biological Weapons Convention to actually restrict the use and development of biological weapons by interfering with the addition of provisions to the treaty that would allow inspections and punishments if you don't adhere to the provisions of the treaty. Okay, so anthrax was one of many biological agents that the United States and at least 10 other countries had stockpiles of. And anthrax is good because it stays in one place. So when you put it down, it hits the ground. Once it hits the ground, it binds to things in the soil and it doesn't re-aerosolize. Only that very special anthrax that was in the anthrax letters, in the second batch of anthrax letters, had any possibility of re-aerosolizing. Normally it doesn't. So example, if you wanted to attack an island like Cuba, you could airdrop it over Cuba and it's not going to spread back to the United States. So that's the advantage of anthrax. It also can be used as a low-intensity warfare weapon to kill animals that are used for crops. So the United States was, in fact, growing anthrax in Terre Haute, Indiana during World War II for a possible attack on Germany. And that would have been in the form of cattle cakes to destroy food availability in Germany. And there are other biological agents that can destroy, cotton crops or coffee crops or other wheat crops, rice. So these weapons don't only have to be aimed at people or at livestock.
All right. So when you're talking about the public not knowing about all of this, what would, if you were somebody who's, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening, they're saying they're totally freaked out. It feels like we're reliving Halloween, but in real life. And they're like, well, what can I do in a situation like this? So we haven't even gotten into the depths of Ebola yet. But it seems like, so over the last couple of years with this pandemic, a lot of people were like, come on, we shouldn't have all of these mandates and whatever, because I don't even want to say it yet on YouTube. And by the way, we're going to continue on the other platforms, but what can they do? I guess they feel like there's the last couple of years, it was overplayed. I think we're hearing the producer butting in right now. It was overplayed. And now what if you get something like an Ebola in the United States? What does the public do with the information that you're giving out? Because it feels so high level.
In general, the public shouldn't be worried about Ebola or anthrax, okay, because they don't spread really airborne, or maybe Ebola very, very rarely might spread airborne. But most people won't be exposed to them if there's a problem. And for anthrax, there are antibiotics that work very well against anthrax, unless it's really been engineered to defeat all antibiotics. But anthrax would not be, because of each of these has a niche, and the niche for anthrax is just one location. I think people shouldn't worry about that. As far as Ebola, the spread is mainly through body fluids, gastric juices, saliva, other body fluids. And so unless you're very close to someone with Ebola, you're not going to get it. Now, so these are not going to spread throughout the United States. So don't worry about that. What we have to worry about instead is something like what we've just experienced for the last 2.5 years. We've had a biologically engineered organism, And then we've had a lot of incorrect information provided to us that told us not to do the things that would have been helpful and to do things that weren't helpful. And so there's another issue here, which is that organisms that have been developed for biological warfare that are intended to actually affect large populations can't be tested ahead of time in large populations. So if you're talking about viruses, they mutate, they spread in ways that can't always be predicted, and so the perpetrators don't know how they're going to behave. So, for example, I believe monkeypox was made in a lab, and it was probably intended to be something more serious than it turned out to be. It was called a public health emergency of international concern by the WHO, as recently as last week they said it again, and the United States has called it a public health emergency of concern, and yet it really turned out to be nothing, and it's almost gone. And what that tells you is that it was developed to be more severe. It was developed to, presumably, to spread more person to person because it hadn't done that in Africa before. It would go from an animal to a human and then stop in Africa. There were very few humans that got it. They told us it was going to be 10% mortality. Well, there's like maybe 1 or 2 people in the entire United States who died, and probably both of them had AIDS as an underlying condition. So I think that the pandemic wasn't as severe as the government told us, and the monkeypox wasn't as severe as the government told us. And if somebody decides to unleash something else on us, they're not going to know how that's going to work either until it happens. So try not to worry too much about it.
That's great. Okay, right. Okay, well, on that note, let's talk about Ebola briefly too. I guess we do want to discuss a little bit what you looked into, like what the question was you were seeking when it comes to Ebola.
So Ebola is a relatively newly diagnosed infectious disease that was first identified in Africa in the 1950s or 60s. And I happen to know that a South African scientist who went to the Congo to collect samples in the 1970s was a biological warfare scientist in South Africa, and probably the purpose was to collect it to use it as a biological weapon. Now, the Central African Ebola outbreaks, there's one in Uganda right now, they happen every so often, and they usually are controlled fairly quickly, was quite different than the West African Ebola outbreak in 2014. What was different was in 2014, there was an American-sponsored lab, NIH lab, right at the epicenter. It was looking at blood samples to see whether people had antibodies to Ebola and a similar virus, Lassa fever. And the principal investigator was actually one of the authors of the fake Nature Medicine article that Dr. Fauci had written to claim that the current pandemic, COVID, couldn't possibly have originated from a lab. And that person was Robert Gary of Tulane University, and he also has a company outside Fort Detrick in Germantown, Maryland. So oddly enough, he was also involved with anthrax vaccine, and he was also involved with AIDS, and now he's been involved with the pandemic, and he was involved with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. That's rather curious.
Can I ask you a question on this note, which is maybe more existential in nature? Talking about a guy like that, or maybe because we don't know him, his intentions, we're not inside his head specifically, but at that level, okay, like generally speaking, at that level of knowledge and action, do you think these people are knowingly acting with malfeasance, or do they somehow sleep well at night thinking that they are benevolent, overlords who are just here to try to help us. And yet they just every once in a while have an oopsie. I mean, because I really try to understand, like, how do these people get to the point where they're doing this kind of work and sleep at night? Like, what is their conscience telling them? Do they think that they're doing this, like, they have reasons that are benevolent, that they think that they could tell you they're just saving the world? They're just, and every once in a while they just make an accident, and sorry, but it's in the name of something higher. Or do you think that they are malevolent in nature?
I'm only guessing, but I assume this Bob Gary works for an intelligence agency and has been a scientist, and he has, a double life as a spook. The fact that he's tried to cover up the origin of AIDS and Ebola, and worked on claims that the anthrax vaccine was dangerous for a reason probably other than what it was. The fact that he was right there at the epicenter in Sierra Leone, and the fact that he was one of the 5 authors of this very famous article in Nature Medicine in March of 2020 that Fauci and Jeremy Farrar and Francis Collins had all been on a phone call with scientists to get it written, which said, oh no, the COVID epidemic couldn't possibly have come from a lab. These are all the reasons. And they made up these fake reasons. And yet it got published in a top journal and had a huge impact. If you go look at how many people have read that article, it's more than almost any other article in the medical literature. So no, I think he doesn't act on his own. He's not just a guy who makes mistakes. He's a guy on a mission. And probably, if he works for an intelligence agency, he probably thinks he's doing it for the good of whatever.
Something that Dr. Robert Malone said the last time he was on, was that a lot of people don't understand that, like, we're sold Fauci as a Dr. Anthony Fauci. But really we should look at him as somebody who's, like, with the DOD. Like, we should look at him more as a national security defense type person than we should see him necessarily as a medical professional, because that would be the level that he's working at. Do you agree with that?
I think it's very complicated. I think Fauci is a money person, and so he gets a lot of money from the DOD, but he also gets a lot of money from the NIH, from HHS, and he gets a lot of money from pharma. And he has shifted the focus of his agency to drug and vaccine development, and almost all the drugs and vaccines that have been licensed in the United States in the last many years his agency has had a hand in, and so his agency actually gets royalties back. And so there's a really complicated, financial motive presumably a financial motive for things he does. So, for example, the Gardasil vaccine, the only vaccine for HPV in the United States, vaccine that the federal agencies have pushed like mad, his agency gets royalties for that. Remdesivir, his agency gets royalties. And so he's working for pharma, he's working for DOD, he's working for HHS, and he's working for Fauci. And I'd love to know if he's so many billions of dollars have passed through his hands, and his net worth is only $10 million. I would have thought his net worth would be a lot more than that.
Yeah, closer to Nancy Pelosi level of income.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. Minimum.
Okay, before we cut the YouTube stream, just so everybody knows, we're going to be continuing live on Rumble and ROKFIN. If you're on Locals, there's a live chat going, and it'll be up later, and on ODYSEE as well in full version. I'm curious. So my husband was in the Marine Corps, and he got the Anthrax series vaccine. Like, I think he said he may have gotten it like 3 or 4 times because they kept forgetting to, keep a record of it. So what was up with that? Like, what's the military connection? And haven't you looked into the anthrax vaccine and potentially Gulf War syndrome? Isn't that a thing now?
Yeah. Yes. So the anthrax vaccine was given as a series of 3 shots within a month, and then another shot 6 months later, and another shot 6 months later, another shot 6 months later, and then yearly boosters. And so your husband, they didn't forget That was just the way he was supposed to get it.
Okay.
Nobody got out without at least 3 shots. And so the company that was making anthrax vaccine for the government used to be called Bioport, and its name now is Emergent Biosolutions. And this is a crooked company. This company has never had any interest in or capability for making a good product. So they've had failures of almost everything they've made. They had to throw away the ingredients for 400 million doses of COVID vaccines. They were making COVID vaccines for several companies. They messed up on other vaccines and have been sued by other companies they were supposed to make those for. And now they're supposed to be making a chikungunya vaccine, I believe, for the government, which we don't need. There's no chikungunya in the United States.
But will there be? I mean, is that why they're making
Well,
it?
you see, this company, they buy up other companies. So they've never been able to make anything themselves. But they bought the company that was making smallpox vaccine. So they bought that portion of Sanofi, and they bought knowing there was an opioid epidemic, they bought the company that makes Narcan, nasal spray. And as soon as they did, so what this company is really successful at is lobbying. And so as soon as they had bought the Narcan company, they managed to get all these laws passed and other guidelines so that all the schools had to have Narcan. In my state, the governor bought one of these Narcan canisters for every 10 residents in the state. I mean, this is ridiculous. And this is an expensive drug. And then she drove around the state doling it out to homeless shelters and food pantries and things like that. So anyway, that's what this company does. And they made this horrible anthrax vaccine. They bought the company in 1998. So Gulf War syndrome was before that. In the Gulf War, other companies made this vaccine, but it's never been a good vaccine. And this company, the founder of it was a business partner of the fellow who became the Assistant Secretary of Health for Preparedness and Emergency Response, Robert Kadlec. And Kadlec is now under Trump. And so he bought lots of anthrax and smallpox vaccine from the company and didn't buy any of the things you actually need for a real pandemic. So we have a $7 billion supply of stuff for pandemics and biological warfare called the National Strategic Stockpile. And when the pandemic hit, he had depleted all those funds buying anthrax and smallpox vaccines, and we didn't have masks, gowns, gloves, and ventilators as we should have had. So for having failed at that, he is now again the aide to Senator Richard Burr, the senator from Pharma, as well as North Carolina. And they are now, he's out there making more trouble. And no doubt is covering up aspects of the pandemic. And he helped to produce a report issued last week from the Republican staff on the origin of COVID. And of course, it just implies that this is a problem of the Chinese. We should have done things differently with the Chinese, but it doesn't really point any fingers at what we did wrong here in the United States.
Is there anything else that you would like to discuss on the topic of anthrax, Ebola, and COVID before we cut the stream and go into your case, what's happening right now with you and your suspension and all the crazy stuff that the state of Maine has done to target you during the pandemic?
Well, I think we should realize that the anthrax vaccine was never properly licensed. And I worked with a group that took the license to court, and we won our case. And federal judge Emmett Sullivan instructed the FDA to revoke the license of the anthrax vaccine, to redo it, to get a clinical trial for efficacy, et cetera. And immediately after that happened, Congress passed the PrEP Act, which created the EUA. So the ability to give Americans on a massive scale an untested, unlicensed product was a result of the problems with the anthrax vaccine and the Defense Department wanting a way to force the anthrax vaccine on soldiers, even after the license had been revoked. And so they slapped the first vaccine or drug in the world to have an EUA was the anthrax vaccine in 2005. And then the DoD immediately started demanding that every soldier take it again. And our group went back to court, and Judge Sullivan said, no, you cannot force soldiers to be guinea pigs. They're already risking their lives for their country, and they don't have to be experimental subjects for pharma. And he said, you may not mandate it. If they want to take it, then they can take it, but you may not mandate it, and you must you must post my ruling in every vaccination center in the military.
Wow. So then what happened with COVID? I mean, they were all forced to do that.
So Judge Sullivan did not get rid of the EUAs in general. What he said was you can't mandate under an EUA. And so the government has been ignoring that ruling ever since.
So
Furthermore,
breaking the law.
The government has been breaking the law and ignoring that ruling. Furthermore, the government after the Gulf War, when we had all these soldiers sick and the DoD wouldn't say what their exposures were, who got which vaccines, what drugs they took, what had happened to cause Gulf War syndrome, a law was passed, or maybe it was an executive order, I don't remember. 1107 was the number, and it said that, okay, if we have a specific military operation and the military really needs soldiers to get an untested, unlicensed product, something that hasn't been proven safe, we'll let you do it, but only if the president makes a declaration that it's necessary. In other words, the president would have to lend his prestige to mandating experimental products on military service members. And so what that means is there's two prohibitions for soldiers, airmen, Navy, etc., to being forced to take experimental products. So that's another law that the government has been breaking. And the Department of Justice was asked to issue an opinion about the legality at the beginning of the pandemic, the legality of mandating experimental products on soldiers. And Dawn Johnson of the Office of Legal Counsel wrote a long opinion saying she thought they might be able to get away with it on civilians, but not soldiers. They've broken that law anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
That opinion, they've ignored that opinion.
You were saying, though, that if the president says that it's necessary, so are you saying that did Trump say that it was necessary then, and that's why he didn't, and they're violating the law?
Trump was gone by then.
Okay.
It was Biden who issued the mandates.
Okay, I see.
And they just broke the law. They pretended that these previous things didn't exist.
There's so many questions I could ask you specific to that. I want to get into your case. Before we do that, though, there were questions that people posed on Locals. I think one of them we can take. Again, everybody, if you're watching this somewhere else, go to AllisonMorrow.locals.com when you have a second. Sign up, become part of my editorial board. You can put questions ahead of time for people like Dr. Nass. It's the value of joining over there. You can go straight to the source for some of the most censored people on the internet. I guess, and not just at the internet, but in real life, because if you weren't here at the beginning of the stream when I was introducing Dr. Nass, she is currently a suspended internist in Maine. Obviously, if you've been listening, she's got a lot of high-level knowledge. It could be part of the reason that she's been targeted for this. But one of the really most egregious cases I had heard of, and I interview censored people, including doctors, almost every day. So to say that it's one of the worst cases, that really says a lot. For misinformation. So what is it? The Board of Licensing in Maine, right? Is that who came after you? Yeah. So the Board of Licensing came after her for misinformation about the pandemic. And you know what that means, the code word misinformation. And then also for the prescriptions that she wrote, which I'm not going to say right now on YouTube, we know that YouTube has its rules about that, but prescription she wrote, so she has to not only she's suing right now, but she's had to face suspension and then also undergo a psychiatric evaluation for practicing medicine the way that the Department of Licensing does not think she should, even though everything that she's done is legal. So I'll just let that sit for you for a while. But one question that somebody asked, I think you can answer before we cut the stream, is if Meryl doesn't get her privileges back, will she consider leaving Maine?
I don't know. If I don't get my license back, it will be amazing because I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't break a single rule, regulation, or law. And so the board has been acting kind of like the government, totally illegally. They weren't aware what the law was. Well, we've schooled them on that. So we'll see. I'm not suing them yet. I'm still in the middle of the hearing. My next hearing day is until the end of January, and then they've given me some dates in March. So this is going to go on for quite some time. And when it's over, I may well sue the board. I certainly would like to. Well, that is my intention because everything they've done to me has basically been illegal.
We talked about this the last time you were on, but it's very discouraging, I think, for people that we both pay for the government's attorneys and we have to then hire attorneys to fight them to follow the laws that they should be following. I feel like there's something wrong with the system when we have to hold them accountable so often, and we're paying so much money for these agencies to exist in the first place to follow the rules. I mean, that's like the whole point of, the government is like, they make the rules and they follow the rules. Like, we elect them to make the rules and follow the rules. And, I don't know, it just seems so discouraging that it's like whack-a-mole now with lawsuits. And if you're not somebody who can afford to do that, it doesn't mean that your rights weren't violated. It means that you just didn't have the money to challenge the government whose lawyers you're paying for as well. It just seems, I don't know. It's very topsy-turvy. And I know you said the last time that it would have been very cost prohibitive for you if you didn't have a partnership with Children's Health Defense, which is taking up your case. So, I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that for people who are in those kinds of situations.
It's an untenable situation because my legal fees are probably around $300,000 already. And I imagine they'll go to at least probably $500,000 by the time we're done. So who can afford that? Especially an older person can't, because that you're taking it out of your retirement. The board also, they wanted to see what I could afford. They wanted to see if I could keep challenging them legally. So they asked me for a financial statement and 4 years of tax returns. And they told me I was going to be billed for the costs of my own prosecution, but that they might give me a break if I was poor enough. And they claimed that was why they wanted my financials. And that if I didn't give it to them, I would be waiving my rights to have any reduction of the cost of my own prosecution. So anyway, my lawyer said, "Hello, you don't get her financials, and she's not waiving any rights, and you don't have the right to do that." So then they backed off. But
Amazing.
It's a game. It's
Yeah.
a game. It's that's all it is, and you have to recognize it. You can't take it personally, because of all of these people are cogs in a dirty machine, and no one person really, did something terrible, except maybe the executive director of the board. But the rest are basically, good Germans. They're just following orders. They don't know any better, and they don't want to know any better.
Okay, well, if you do want to know better, we'll see you on Rumble and ROKFIN as we continue. Thanks, everybody, for your support. And again, also go to Locals, alisonmara.locals.com. We're going to take a couple questions for Dr. Nass in a second.